the recorder now, so everything is rolling and working. Excellent.
Very good.
So the setup for this episode of the podcast is a focus on graduate studies and environmental history and the core question of why students pursue environmental history in the first place. So I'm interviewing 4 graduate students about their dissertation research, why they chose the topics, and why environmental history is one of the fields that they're interested in terms of their doctoral studies. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 61 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And why don't you start just by stating your name and what university you're at?
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I am at the University of Saskatchewan.
Hey, Jessica. So you are in the PhD program at USask, and I wanted to get a sense from you what your dissertation topic is. So could you just tell listeners what it is you're researching for your dissertation?
Certainly. It's pretty complex, but the basic gist of it is that it's a comparative history of provincial park development in Canada and state park development in the United States. And I'm focusing on 4 specific park systems, which are Idaho and Pennsylvania in the States, and Alberta and Ontario in Canada. And at the broadest level, it's looking at these park systems using 3 main comparative levels. That is Canada versus US, West versus East, and then also urban versus rural, because in each of these 4 park systems, I also have 2 case studies, one rural and usually one of the first parks created in that state or province, and then also an urban park in each of the park systems.
So my first follow-up question, of course, is why you chose this topic. Why are you looking at provincial and state parks, and why are you taking this comparative approach?
Okay, well, I got into this. It's a deeply personal level. I grew up 1 mile outside of a state park in Pennsylvania, Cook Forest State Park. And I grew up as an only child in the middle of the woods. And my parents owned rental cabins, so 100-year-old log cabins that they rented out to vacationers. So our livelihood growing up depended on a state park. So everything about my upbringing revolved around that state park. And then when I went into undergrad and decided to become a history major, it coalesced with a really difficult time in my life when my parents went bankrupt and we lost everything. We lost the cabins. We lost our home. And me being a burgeoning scholar at the time, I took that kind of pain and sadness, and I started thinking critically about why we were there in the first place. Why was this tourism community located outside of this state park? Why had it had its heyday in the 70s and 80s? And why was it now dying? So I did my senior thesis. I interviewed 35 local current and former business owners from that community that I grew up in. So that's how I started on the topic of state parks. When I was doing the interviews, one of the business owners presented me with this scrapbook that one of the members of the Cook family, so Cook Forest State Park was named after the Cook family, which was a lumber dynasty. And it was a scrapbook that the Cook family, one of the Cook family members had put together of all of newspaper articles, etc., from an 18-year campaign to make Cook Forest State Park a state park. So that's what I went into my MA at the University of Rochester with, and that's what I based my MA thesis on. So, but at the time, I didn't really know I was doing environmental history. Rochester now has a pretty good environmental history program, but at the time they're very focused on intellectual and cultural history. So I went through my entire MA without reading any environmental history. My MA supervisor told me that I was a policy historian. And I was like, ugh, I don't want to be a policy historian. That doesn't really feel right. So I started, when I started looking at PhD programs, that's when I discovered environmental history. And I realized, oh, this is perfect. This is what I'm actually doing, firstly. Secondly, as a person who grew up so close to nature, like the forest was like my everything, right? It allows me to keep connected to that while also building off of my strengths in writing and analysis and that sort of thing. So that's how I kind of got into environmental history accidentally. I just discovered that it existed. Seemed pretty cool.
Was there anything that you read in particular that drew you to it? If you hadn't been exposed to it or taken courses at the master's level, was there a book or an article?
Well, I started listening to this podcast called Nature's Past. True story. And I also, I'm trying to remember. I don't think I read that much. I started listening to Nature's Past, and I started looking at potential and contacting potential supervisors that on the department website said they did environmental history, and started talking to them about potential projects. And they were like, "Yeah, this is environmental history. This is what you should be doing." So I went into my PhD with very little background in environmental history, but I made up for it significantly. And I ended up at the University of Saskatchewan mainly because my supervisor, Jeff Comfer, was so supportive in the application process. And I decided I wanted to expand what I was doing considerably, and that I did want to do a Canadian versus United States topic, in that I decided also that if I really was going to learn Canadian environmental history, I was probably going to have to come to Canada for it, because not taught a whole lot in the States. The States might be slightly navel-gazing. That's why I ended up here mainly. Yeah.
So what were you exposed to at University of Saskatchewan in terms of your PhD studies in environmental history?
So I had 3 fields of study, of course, for my comps. And my main field of study was a comparative North American topic, which focused, there was a bit about Mexico, but it was mainly Canada and the United States environmental history. And it was co-supervised by Jeff Comfer and Bill Wazer. So Jeff took on choosing the United States topics for me, and Bill Wazer, who is a Canadianist, helped me look at Canadian topics. And they also made sure that several, I think 3 to 4 weeks of my readings, so probably about 20 books at least, of the 100 were park histories. And then I also I also did a comparative Canadian American West topic, which had a lot of environmental history involved, of course, because you can't really analyze the West without thinking of wilderness, etc. And that also influenced my decision to broaden my topic, not just to comparing United States and Canada, but also looking at the way that management and creation of parks differs from the east to west.
So I'm curious, I guess, about a negative question. Why not policy history? What was it about environmental history that drew you to that subfield? And what was it about environmental history that allowed you to explore the topic in the way that you wanted to explore?
Yeah. So I guess I was dismayed at being labeled as a policy historian because I think that um, park history suffers from being too policy oriented, and that a lot of park histories that I have read are formulaic. They are obsessed with origin stories. So, um, what what did the well-to-do white men do, in politics to get this piece of land saved, right? And then the story ends. Um, and what I wanted to do is kind of push the boundaries of park history. So my dissertation isn't particularly what one would necessarily expect a park history to be, in that I don't really focus on recreation a whole lot, and I don't focus on how these parks came to be a whole lot. So I'm looking more at the material um, effects of park creation. So I'm looking at resource extraction. I'm looking at the ways that parks can act as regional tools of restoration. So looking beyond parks as islands of preservation, looking beyond the boundaries. I'm also looking at the way that we manipulate the environment to suit our ideas of recreation, particularly with water, dam creation, altering levels of lakes, etc. And then I'm also looking at peripheral communities. So that's where my background as a child of park tourism comes into play. When I see a park, I see a place of work. I see a place of labor. And I don't see that in a lot of histories of parks. We focus on the visitors. We don't focus on the people who are drawn to the peripheries of parks. We don't focus on the people who are pushed to the peripheries of parks, most notably Indigenous people. So I'm looking at that as well. So all of those things are so intricate and so go far beyond what analysis of park policy can really tell us. And hopefully in the future with my work, I can look at the common people that are affected by park creation. I do think I've written some rallying calls for looking at beyond the policymakers, and that requires broadening both the geographical scope of park histories as well as the temporal scope. So I hope that my dissertation proves to push those boundaries.
Now, your research began from a personal place and a personal experience that led you to ask a series of questions. Do you think that environmental history has helped you to find answers to any of those questions?
I don't know if it's helped me answer the questions. It's helped me understand my life experience, I guess, in the relationship to national trends or North American trends. Helped me understand the ebb and flow of the tourism community that I grew up in. But I found that more than answering my personal questions, it's really broadened the way that I look at parks.
Okay, my name is Robin Meller, and I am a PhD candidate in history at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
So, Robin, why don't you start off by telling listeners about your dissertation research? What's your topic? What are you studying?
So my topic is a comparative analysis of the environmental history of uranium mining in Canada, the United States, and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I used 3 case studies, one from each country, to examine the programs in each country.
So this is a transnational study, transnational comparative study of 3 different countries, but all within the same orbit or sector of uranium mining.
Correct, yes.
And what brought you to the topic?
So I started it in my 4th year of my undergraduate study at Queen's University. I was really interested in Russian history at the time and in Cold War history. And then I became really interested in environmental history. And so for my final essay during my second last semester at Queen's, I decided to look into the history of uranium mining on both sides of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. And that's how I kind of came upon it. And I didn't find very much for that project, so I wanted to learn more.
So a topic like this could be studied from a number of different subdisciplinary perspectives. This could be a business history. This could be a history of political economy. But you are doing your graduate studies in environmental history. So one of the things I'm curious about is what brings graduate students to environmental history. What drew you to the subfield?
I would say for me, it was something that I became really interested in just when I was an undergraduate. And I kind of accidentally just fell into environmental history, and I found the viewpoint so fascinating that I wanted to kind of incorporate uranium itself into this narrative and how the characteristics of uranium and how it behaves affected the history of its extraction and how it interacts with human beings.
And this is something that you didn't see as a possibility within, say, political history?
No, I don't think so. I think that there has been a lot done in terms of, at least in the United States, in U.S. history, in terms of diplomatic history of uranium mining. And I think that often cuts off the ability to look at what's going on comparatively, especially if you're just looking at a comparison of political systems. You miss a lot of the similarities that are connecting these programs and then a lot of the important differences. And so I think the diplomatic aspect and the political aspect are important, and they're huge parts of my dissertation as well. But I think this kind of just adds another level of being able to see what actually happened with these programs and understand the effects that they had, the impacts on the environment and on people by comparing them. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, this is a really interesting point. I want to make sure I understand. If I'm understanding what you're saying, do you see environmental histories focus on non-human nature as a way of looking at or observing historical processes across political boundaries?
Yes, I do. And I also see it as as a way to kind of isolate some of the things that have just been taken as accepted facts in some places that I don't think are necessarily accurate. And I think if you blame it on a certain political system or a certain bureaucratic choice without including these non-human actors, you're not getting a full picture of what actually happened or an accurate idea of what happened.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I've got some follow-up questions on this last one about what drew you to environmental history. One of them is bibliographic, I suppose. Was there a book or books that caught your attention early in your scholarly studies that brought environmental history into your thinking?
Yes. So the first course I took in environmental history was called The Environmental History of North America. And the book that really just blew my mind when I was an undergraduate was Nature's Metropolis, as I'm sure it happened for a lot of other people. Mm-hmm. And also Awful Splendor by Stephen Pine was just, I mean, all these ideas that were coming out of these books, they just expanded the way I was thinking in a way I had never thought about history before. And the more I delved into it, there were just so many ideas that kept coming up. And I still have all these books with just multiple exclamation points in the margins. Dust Bowl was another one for me. And Plagues and Peoples was also extremely influential to my thinking early on.
So finally, this might be a difficult question to answer at this point, but in terms of how far you've come along in your doctoral studies and your particular dissertation project, do you feel like an environmental history approach has begun to answer some of the questions that you've had at the outset of your research?
So I would say, actually, I went in not understanding the question I was asking. And I think the environmental history approach has kind of helped me to find that main question and really articulate what I wanted to say. So when I went in, I just really wanted to compare these places and maybe even one-dimensionally just the environmental and the health effects. And as we discussed earlier, I think environmental history has really allowed me to draw many more connections between these places or among these places than I would have before. And it's also allowed me to, I think, understand exactly, I don't want to say what went wrong, what factors led to a bunch of the discrepancies I was noticing in my research and also in the literature. And I think without environmental history, I would not have understood why these common misconceptions continue to come up, or why these things that actually that were kind of held to be true but didn't play out in the documents, why they were happening. So if I had not have been thinking about my project from this point of view of uranium and the way it's deposited in nature and the way it behaves, if I hadn't have been thinking about that, I don't think I would have fully understood what happened historically and what narrative came out of what happened.
Okay. All right. So, hello, my name is Evelyn Ramiel, and I am a York University PhD student in the history department. And I am focusing on modern Japanese environmental history, with a special focus for me on histories that relate, technology, human bodily experience, and non-human life or inorganic substances. So all of my research so far has focused on broadly that intersection.
And full disclosure here for listeners, Evelyn was a student in my environmental history seminar in our graduate program last year at York University. So we just get that out on the table so that everyone knows that this is a completely biased interview.
Yes, entirely.
So Evelyn, why don't we just start with letting listeners know what your dissertation topic is, the sort of broad outline to it.
All right. Well, I'm in my first year, so a broad outline is about most of the substance of it. But I will say that it's come together rather differently than I expected. So there might be some good stuff to talk about there. So my current topic is looking at the intersection of the origins of the Japanese industrial chemical industry and the creation of the Japanese film industry. So obviously, if you know anything about film, it's created from a fairly intensive process of chemical refinement and production in order to, reproduce photographic images. And so chemical industrialists were often also pioneers in the film industry. And right now, some of my sort of pre-writing study is gone into looking at the figure of Inabata Katsutaro, who founded I believe, still extant chemicals firm that was involved in some of the first production of motion picture film in Japan. And so the topic really relates around how the film industry is intimately connected with nature, both in its subject, in other words, in the things that are shown in front of the screen, as well as in the substance of the film itself. And that's really most of what there is at the moment. But yeah, that I've become really interested in visual technologies, or technologies that allow people to see nature in different ways, and also the kind of raw, more material aspects of how those technologies are created and how they affect human bodies, and in this case largely the eye, but in other ways as well. So that's basically the summary of it.
So this is an incredibly creative approach to not just Japanese history, but history in general, thinking both across multidisciplines here of cultural history, environmental history, history of science and technology. How did you come up with this idea? What brought you to this topic?
Yes. So one of the unique things about me is that, or about my situation, is that I have a partner, my wife, Jacqueline, who is an animation studies PhD. And we are very much interested in sharing what we've been studying back and forth. So part of the reason why I became interested in photography was I'm currently taking a full year course with Bernard Lightman at York University on the history of science in Britain during the 19th century. And one of the most important innovations that happened during that time was the creation of photography as a scientific resource. So I got really interested in photography as part of the history of science, which definitely, and Japan, of course, has a long history of film production and of the use of photography for all kinds of reasons. So I started to basically link together some things I had studied about the history of Japanese science, the history of photography, and my kind of shared passion with my partner for film studies and film theory. And I really wanted to do something that actually linked all of those things, because that's really what makes me excited.
So your scholarly approach is obviously multidisciplinary, but environmental history has been a part of that, and that's part of what I'm interested in for this interview is why environmental history has been a part of your scholarly interest. How did it come on your radar, and what effects has it had on your thinking about the past and about your scholarship?
Yeah, so my first encounter with environmental history came in a rather rigorous historiography course that I took in my undergrad, which was mandatory at at my alma mater, and so I came into that course with a very kind of social history, economics based approach to how I thought about things, derived from some of my studies in post-colonial history and so forth. But and when I was first exposed to environmental history, I thought it was rather a little bit scandalous, honestly, because it was saying things about the relationship between human beings and nature that really disrupted a lot of my thinking. And I left my undergrad thinking I would be a sort of run-of-the-mill social historian. But ultimately it got barbs into me, and I carried it sort of, like a burr on my lapel or whatever, out into the world. And once I got into York, I had found that my interests had completely reshifted around environmental history, because I saw it as a way to put that social history I was really interested in my undergraduate years into an even more comprehensive context. And I took courses with Colin Coates and with you, Sean, here at York, and that has really only stoked the little spark I had coming to York, and it's completely reshaped my studies around questions of technology and nature. So
I'm very curious about the reaction that you had to first being introduced to the subfield, about being disrupted, or your thinking being disrupted. Can you explain a little further what you found disruptive about environmental history as a discipline?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I was in a very social history kind of mode of thinking going into this historiography course I took in undergrad. And the way that the instructor introduced the topic of environmental history was through Donald Worster, and one of his theoretical essays, the name of which escapes me, but it was essentially a summary of environmental history's aims. And one of the sections of that was specifically a polemic against Marxist approaches that did not integrate nature properly in Donald Worster's mind. And that was exactly the kind of angle I was coming from. So I felt it as a sort of personal affront. And that was a lot of the reason why I had an initial resistance, is because I sort of felt called out by Donald Worster. And I was, that's really what really disrupted it, though, was the idea that human agency in the world was limited to an extent that I was not familiar with thinking about. And the idea that natural forces could carry a kind of agency or even selfhood of their own really, it as I said, it stuck with me, but it also kind of disturbed me at the time. Because I had a very anthropocentric view of how history worked at that time.
And your work now in your PhD studies is bringing you into histories of technology and histories of science. Do you see environmental history informing those fields?
I really hope that it does more. I think that histories of science, as I've been exposed to during my current course of study, is really excellent at unearthing sort of aspects of science that have previously, gone unexamined, or it has been doing, the field has been doing that for several decades now. And I'm really interested in bringing that kind of rigorous criticism of scientific practice into the kind of physical aspects of scientific study itself. So, for instance, I used to think about the Large Hadron Collider, and one of the really important aspects of it is that it's buried under the mountains. And not only that, it involved a huge amount of resource extraction and energy use just to function. So in other words, I'm interested not only in looking at the sort of discursive categories in which science operates, the sort of social hierarchies that it might or might not reinforce, but also the way that science makes itself out of raw material, and how people's views of technology affect the way that they interact with nature on a more personal level, in a more close up, and that's really what's come out of it, I suppose. That's where I see environmental history, the sort of the messier, dirtier aspect of it, coming into the more cultural realm of histories of science and tech.
So I have one last question, and it may be too early in your doctoral studies to answer it fully, but I want to ask it anyways. Right. Where is your social historian now? If you came into your academic studies thinking about social history and being introduced to environmental history, histories of science and technology, and changing your thinking, have you moved away from social history, or does your thinking still informed somewhat by what you learned from social history?
It's difficult to say at this point because my studies are at an are, as you said, at an early stage. But my impression of myself is that I've moved away from social history frameworks that I see as explicitly human-centered or even Promethean in their in some of their content. And in particular, Marxism was extremely influential on me, and still remains so. But I have learned more about it, I think, in stepping away from explicit adherence to it and looking back at it from a new perspective. And I'm not sure where that's leading, but I'm still really interested in questions of hierarchy and questions of power and of class. But I can no longer look at those things without looking at the air, the soil, the water, the interactions of human beings with non-human or more than human life, and with the non-human environment. So I guess it's been a bit of a metamorphosis.
Okay, my name is Micah Jorgensen, and I'm a PhD student in environmental history at McMaster University in my 4th year.
So, Micah, let's just begin by letting listeners know a little bit about your dissertation research. What's your topic? What have you been investigating?
So for the last 3.5 years, I have been studying the international connections between gold rush mining zones in the late 19th and early 20th century. And specifically, I've been researching the ways in which one of Canada's oldest mining areas, the Porcupine in Northern Ontario, interacted with some of its mining neighbors. So I'm really interested in the relationship between transnational, migratory, corporate, and scientific networks and industrialization in the Canadian mining economy at the turn of the century.
And I think a natural question for any graduate student's dissertation topic is why? What brought you to the topic? What were some of the big questions that you were hoping to answer?
Well, it's a long and convoluted story, I think, as with most.
I'm all ears.
So this work is an extension of my master's research. So during my master's, I wrote a thesis on First Nations participation in the Cariboo Gold Rush in British Columbia, talked about the ways in which Indigenous people interacted with the economic systems and the legal systems in that gold rush. And during my studies, I really noticed that there were a lot of similarities between the stories that people were telling about Barkerville and the stories that they were telling about other mining areas. So for example, the story of Barkerville and its discovery and its development has a lot in common with the story of the development and discovery of gold in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States. And British Columbia the gold rush in British Columbia is often touted as being this national story. The threat of American expansionism is part of the impetus for the railway and for Confederation in 1867. And so I wondered, what if this is not a national story? What would that mean? How would that change the way that we think about Barkerville and the stories that we tell ourselves about our origin stories in the North and in British Columbia and in Canada as a whole? And this is all part of Ted Binnema always scolded me for being a bit of a myth buster. I like to kind of question those myths and turn them on their heads a little bit. So it was just kind of part of me prodding that national myth, that national foundation story. Is it really a national myth, or is this something bigger and broader? Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, when I was in the Barkerville archives doing that research, I saw that there was like a lot of evidence around environmental history and landscape change that had not really been studied. And also being on the land in Barkerville, I saw a lot of that environmental change, like huge tailings mounds, big pits in the mountains, rusted equipment lying around in the bush. There was like this old ditch line that went for kilometers through the forest, almost a perfect grade that we used to bike along. And I wanted to kind of know how all that stuff got there, who those people had been who had modified the landscape to such a significant extent, and what their motives had been.
Picking up on this idea of myth busting.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about environmental history and whether or not you think that studying in environmental history has helped you with that myth busting? Is there something about that subfield that lends it towards breaking apart these kinds of tropes or understandings of history?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure how productive myth busting actually is. I think that maybe it's not that useful to set up these straw men and then cut them down, which has been my habit occasionally. But I think that in environmental history, it allows you to approach a subject, a topic, a narrative that is entrenched in history, in our conception of the way that the past was. It allows us to approach the past from a new angle and kind of see different motives, different forces that shaped human behavior than before. And that then shapes our narrative of history and changes the way that we think about ourselves and about the past.
So is this what got you into environmental history? Was it this way of seeing the past in a different way, or were there other avenues that brought you to it? Was it the landscapes that you were seeing?
I think there's a lot of factors that brought me to environmental history. So I am from a very outdoorsy family. I think that's probably common. A lot of environmental historians spend a lot of time outside. My parents went to forestry school. My brother is an environmental engineer. So maybe it's in my blood to some extent. But at the same time, I had always been interested in, when I was in my undergraduate degree and in high school, I was always really interested in military history, and in which, I don't know, I think that's a classic avenue that a lot of emerging and budding historians, they tend to start, classical or military history. But then looking back on, with the benefit of hindsight, I can look back on my interest in military history and I can kind of see I was actually really drawn to the external ways in which people and their actions were shaped. So how the landscape affected strategy, how horses and dogs worked into military battles and that kind of thing. And so I think that environmental history became a way of bringing together my interest in human motivations and human actions and how those are shaped by non-human figures, and my tendency towards biology, geology, geography, and these more scientific sides of environmental studies and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Another part of the question too might be what you read. Was there a book or set of books that introduced you to environmental history or helped you rethink the kinds of historical questions you were trying to answer?
Yeah, there was a few books. At the University of Northern British Columbia, where I did my undergraduate and my master's degree, I read a book, and now I'm going to have to look up the author, Sean, because I don't remember what it was. But
we'll cut this part out.
It was called The 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. I'm just Googling. Matthew Restall, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. So while I was at UNBC, I was working with Dr. Jacqueline Haller as part of my undergrad, and she introduced me to this book, The 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest by Matthew Restall. And that book, again, coming back to my myth-busting tendencies, I suppose, offered a lot of really fresh perspectives, including some environmental history of the Spanish Conquest. And that really interested me and got me hooked. But then later in my undergraduate and my master's degree, Ted Binnema at the University of Northern British Columbia, he had students read the Hudson's Bay Company journals. We actually hold them at UNBC in the library on microfilm. So this was kind of like a form of torture, because he was sending these poor, unsuspecting fourth-year undergraduate students and first-year master's students to spend hours and hours and hours going over this microfilm in the library. But the stuff that was in that microfilm was so fascinating. So for anybody that's had a chance to read the Hudson's Bay Company journals, there are these great accounts written by often isolated traders working in a fort somewhere in the middle of the wilderness. And they record all kinds of things. So sometimes it's just an inventory of things that they traded with local people. Often if they were more inclined to write more details. They would write the details of their lives, the little joys, the little frustrations, the little interactions with the plants and the animals that they experienced every day. And I really got drawn into these primary sources in my upper level undergrad and grad degree. And having the freedom to kind of explore those primary sources was what really got me hooked on environmental history. It was like, wow, these are some really cool accounts of human and environmental interaction. The stories they're funny, they're interesting, they're engaging, and they're really relatable. I can put myself in the shoes of these people who were writing these accounts.
It sounds like your more recent work, your PhD work, is thinking a bit more globally. Has environmental history informed the expansion of your outlook on the history of mining?
So one of the central tenets, I guess, of environmental history, one of the things that environmental scholars do very well is that they question the authority of political borders. So there are a lot of works in environmental history, for example, that talk about the way in which water or animals move across borders, transcend political boundaries. And in doing so, question our idea of the boundaries of the state. So that was one of, I had become interested in this gold rush story that was a very national story. It's a national story in Canada. It's also a national story in Australia. It's also a national story in New Zealand and South Africa and the United States. And environmental history kind of inspired me to think about this story as a international story, as something that transcended boundaries, as part of a continuum rather than isolated event.
Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Jessica DeWitt, Micah Jorgensen, Robin Meller, Evelyn Ramiel, and me, Sean Karash. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with your favorite podcast player, and leave us comments. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about environmental history research in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And you can find out more about the topics we discussed on this episode on our show notes page. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.